Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's briefing, FDA Approval Pathways 101. I'm Devin Latta, Program and Research Associate at the Alliance for Health Policy. For those who are not familiar with the Alliance, welcome. We are a nonpartisan resource for the policy community dedicated to advancing knowledge and understanding of health policy issues. You can join today's conversation on Twitter using the hashtag AllHealthLive and join our community at AllHealthPolicy, as well as on Facebook and LinkedIn. Today's panel has a Q&A section at the end of the event. We want you all to be active participants, so please have your questions ready. You should see a dashboard on the right side of your screen that has a speech bubble icon with a question mark. You can use that icon to submit questions you have for the panelists at any time. We will collect these and address them during the broadcast. Throughout the webinar, you can also chat about any technical issues you may be experiencing, and someone will attempt to help. This event is made possible with support from Arnold Ventures. We are grateful to have Andrea Noda, Vice President of Healthcare and Drug Pricing at Arnold Ventures, here to give us opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Let me start by telling you a little bit about Arnold Ventures and our work in healthcare. Arnold Ventures is a philanthropy dedicated to tackling some of the most pressing problems in the United States. Our healthcare team is driven by the belief that healthcare must be affordable and accessible for families, employers, and taxpayers. Our work specifically on prescription drugs focuses on the drivers of high drug and biologic prices, which include patent abuses and anti-competitive behaviors, market distortions, and high launch prices and prices that are increasing over time. We are also focused on ways that the FDA approval process can incentivize clinically meaningful innovation by using evidence based on patient outcomes, and that clinical trial data be more transparent, complete, and comparable across products. As Congress works towards its reauthorization of the FDA user fee programs, there has been a lot of discussion about provisions in both the House and the Senate that would modify the Accelerated Approval Pathway, which expedites the FDA's approval of certain drugs and biologics. FDA's controversial accelerated approval of the Alzheimer's drug Aduhelm and CMS's decision to restrict its coverage to patients in approved clinical trials generated a lot of recent attention, which put a spotlight on FDA's drug approval process. We hope today's event helps you put this important policy issue into the broader context of the drug development process, FDA's mission, and its process for approving different types of drugs and biologics. Thank you to the Alliance team for your partnership on this event. I'm really excited for the opportunity to learn from all of the incredible experts on the panel today. And with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Now I'm excited to introduce Dr. Marta Boshinska. Marta is a visiting fellow at USC Brookings Schaefer Initiative for Health Policy and will be leading our conversation today. Marta brings experience and expertise in prescription drugs. Her government experience includes serving as director of the Bureau of Economics at the Federal Trade Commission, chief healthcare economist at the Office of the Inspector General at HHS, and Director of Economic Staff at the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. She also served as an economic advisor to the U.S. Senate Finance Committee. Dr. Boshinska, we are so excited to have you here with us, and I turn the stage over to you.
Thank you so much for your introduction, and thanks to all of you for joining us for this important discussion around FDA approval pathways. Now I would like to introduce our audience to today's exciting lineup of panelists. Their full bios are included in the webinar materials, but I would like to provide brief introductions here. First, we have Dr. Reshma Ramachandran, a board-certified family physician and second-year fellow within the Yale National Clinical Scholars Program, where her research focuses on the realignment of incentives for healthcare stakeholders, including pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, and universities, towards prioritizing equitable patient access to safe, effective health technologies. Previously, Reshma worked as faculty as part of the Innovation and Design Enabling Access Initiatives, IDEA, at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Next, we have Dr. Kelly George, who is a principal of regulatory strategy for FDA policy at Avalier Health, where she supports clients in navigating the FDA policy environment for drugs, biologics, and medical devices. Prior to joining Avalier, Kelly focused on pipeline technologies in pre-FDA approval phases of development at the Innovation Institute. She also focused on business strategy development and in-depth market analysis. In addition to the work with the Center, we also have, I apologize, we also have Dr. Amit Sarpatwari, who is an assistant professor of medicine of Harvard Medical School and the assistant director of the program on regulation, therapeutics, and law called Portal within the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology and Pharmacoeconomics at Brigham and Women's Hospital. His research focuses on his interdisciplinary training as an epidemiologist and lawyer, and focuses on the effects of laws and regulations on therapeutic development, approval, use, and related public health outcomes. Finally, we have Clay Alsbach, who is principal at Levitt Partners. Clay specializes in federal health policy and advocacy related to the FDA, Medicare, Medicaid, private health insurance, and digital health. Prior to joining Levitt Partners, Clay served 7 years on the U.S. House of Representatives Energy and Commerce Committee. Now we're going to let our panelists introduce the topic to us before we get into the question and answer section of today's event. Reshma, let's start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm very much looking forward to giving kind of a broad overview, and really from a clinical standpoint. I'm a practicing physician who sees patients, and the role of FDA is critically important for the work I do, not just on the research side, but really for my day-to-day clinical practice in taking care of patients. Next slide. So I'll be speaking a little bit more about FDA's role in terms of protecting patients, providers, and the public. Next slide. So just some disclosures. I don't have any relevant financial relationships with any sort of commercial entities that produce any regulated healthcare products. And I also serve as a co-director for the Yale collaboration for research integrity and transparency, or CRIT, which is supported by Arnold Ventures. I do also some advocacy work on the FDA space through Doctors for America, where I chair the FDA task force. Next slide. So just going to start off with kind of some level setting in terms of the FDA and what it does as a regulator. This is the FDA's mission statement, and I've highlighted some key areas that I thought would be good to kind of walk through. So you can see here, the FDA in its mission statement clearly states that it ensures the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biologic products, and medical devices, and that it helps to speed innovations that make medical products more effective, safer, and more affordable. And just within these lines, you can see kind of this tension and the balance that FDA needs to strike as a regulator in terms of ensuring timely access to promising medical treatments across drugs, devices, and other areas, and also ensuring that they are also truly safe and effective before they reach patients. The other part, just to highlight, is that FDA does play a role in terms of affordability. I think that's something that's a bit understated in a lot of our discussions around drug pricing, but really FDA's role in terms of setting regulatory standards for safety and efficacy drives innovation in so many ways, and they also help to award incentives that also play a role in terms of affordability of various products. I think some of our speakers are going to be speaking to that later on today. Next slide. So just to give a kind of a bird's eye view of FDA's footprint, the role of FDA is just incredible, just with our day-to-day spending, our human lives. It regulates 25 cents of every dollar that's spent here in the United States. And really from a clinical standpoint and for my work in seeing patients, the FDA's role really can't be understated. Nearly 70% of outpatient visits actually involve medication therapy, which means that FDA's role in terms of ensuring safety and efficacy of these treatments is critically important when I make prescription decisions with my patients. Nearly 80% of even hospital ER visits also involve medication therapies. And then on top of that, the percent of people who actually use prescription drugs is quite astronomical. And these are numbers that are from the CDC. And I just want to point out, even for thinking about patients are using 3 or more drugs, 5 or more drugs, it's still pretty significant proportions of our population. that are within this group. The other part of this is kind of the FDA's disproportionate impact, I would say, on our older patients and also communities of color. So both of these groups, we know from national epidemiological data, are groups that are oftentimes prescribed more drugs and have to take greater numbers of drugs for their day-to-day lives and for chronic conditions. For older adults, this increases over time, and we have issues related to polypharmacy that FDA also plays a huge role in. And also for communities of color, because of structural racism and other structural determinants of health, they then tend to have higher burdens of disease and be prescribed more drugs. So FDA really has a disproportionate impact in terms of its regulatory standards in affecting these patient populations, making it critically important from an equity perspective that these regulatory standards are being upheld as high as possible. Next slide. So FDA's focus has actually changed over time, and I just kind of wanted to paint this picture for folks to kind of understand how the landscape has really changed in thinking about FDA regulatory policy. Initially when FDA was constructed, it only had a focus on safety, but in the 1950s and 1960s, when there were many case reports and indications that for the drug thalidomide, which was being administered to pregnant persons, for treatment of morning sickness, that there was causing birth defects, there was kind of a shift in terms of thinking about FDA as not an agency that regulates the safety of products that are being given to patients, but also looking at efficacy and also mandating that sponsors actually demonstrate efficacy of products before approval and before they reach patients. On top of that, in 1962, with the Caffaro-Harris Amendment, this idea of informed consent came into play. So participants that were in clinical trials actually had to be informed of the risks and benefits of treatments that they would be receiving for clinical trial testing. And so this kind of harkened a new age for the FDA in terms of mandating adequate and well-controlled clinical trials to demonstrate efficacy of treatments that were coming to market. Afterwards, we saw kind of a series of legislation really focused on speed or more timely access to various products, and this ranged across therapeutic areas or areas where there were patients with unmet needs or with limited options really on the market for treatment. And you can see examples of this here, various bills that have been passed over the years, and even regulatory policy that have actually made these expedited review pathways that will be discussed later on also come to light as well. And now we have user fee reauthorizations that happen every 5 years that have also introduced greater speed in terms of bringing new drugs to market, but really shifting the landscape in many ways in terms of how we actually test and view efficacy. And I'll talk about this a little bit later on. And then of course we have large packages like 21st Century Cures that get into this space as well. Next slide. So basically, what does the FDA do? It approves drugs, devices, and other medical products as safe and effective for conditions of use prescribed or suggested within the drug label. And I just wanted to kind of hit home that the indication that's approved is really for a specific disease or a disease class by the FDA that's on the drug label. There's usually a specific population, so adults of a certain age or children or a subset of patients within this group, and then also the dose and duration of drug studies. Just to clarify this, I think this is oftentimes lost, the burden is really on sponsors to demonstrate that the drug is safe and effective for proposed use within the application that's submitted to the FDA. It's not FDA's job to actually demonstrate safety and efficacy from the data that's submitted. It's really the sponsor's role to actually demonstrate this. If you can click the next slide. And I just wanted to highlight this, FDA issues what we call guidances, and this is what we call, the regulatory policy that comes from FDA for sponsor that outlines the parameters really for safety and efficacy to determine what the standards are for regulatory review. And the reason why I highlighted this is because, this isn't like, the rule of law and not necessarily like binding in many ways, but this gives FDA some regulatory flexibility once sponsors submit applications around parameters for safety and efficacy. And so there can be some fluidity to this, and we've seen some recent examples of this, in years past, and there's been some extrapolation that comes from clinical trials onto the drug label that FDA uses, sometimes appropriately and sometimes inappropriately, in making regulatory review decisions. Next slide. And then the last thing I just wanted to kind of point out with this star is that FDA doesn't regulate clinical practice. So once a product is approved and made available to patients on the market, clinicians are able to prescribe it for other off-label off-label uses. And the reason why I bring that up is because oftentimes drugs and individual medical products are actually approved for multiple indications. So when an indication, a single indication for a particular disease is withdrawn from the market, that drug is still made available for patients for other indications. And clinicians can still prescribe this, for an off-label use. And so there comes kind of this sometimes confusion from the clinical perspective when indications are actually withdrawn from the market, but the drug's still available for patients, what withdrawal actually means, and what, who actually bears the costs of these withdrawals. And we can talk about a little bit more about this in the discussion section as well, especially related to accelerated approval. Next slide. So just to give an overview of FDA's approval process, this is the traditional approval process, and I think the next speaker is me going through the expedited review processes. Drugs are usually developed, oftentimes in laboratories, universities, and in public research settings. Then they're tested in animals to be able to look to see whether or not there is significant toxic effects. If there's not significant toxicity that's viewed in animals, then the sponsor is able to submit what's called an IND application or an investigational new drug application to the FDA, which outlines a protocol for testing in humans or clinical trial testing. If FDA, upon review of the IND application, thinks that it's safe to go forward with clinical trial testing in humans, then the sponsor starts with phase 1 studies, which is usually done in just a few tens of patients just to look at safety. Then phase 2 studies, which is then done not in healthy volunteers as it was in phase 1 studies, but actually in patients with specific disease or conditions of interest. Again, a very small patient population to look at safety and efficacy. And then from there, if there's some signal that there might be some efficacy of this drug for a particular disease or condition, the FDA and the sponsor meet to discuss this and actually plan what a larger phase 3 study that's actually going to be conducted in hundreds or if not thousands of patients would look like. That phase 3 study looks at efficacy more so, looks at specific doses and durations for the drug, and also looks at other safety issues related to the drug as well. Next slide. From there, after the phase 3 studies are completed, FDA and the sponsor will then convene to actually discuss ahead of a new drug application being filed what the results actually showed. And sometimes FDA can say, even before the phase 3 study has been completed, that there might need to be changes that actually need to occur. So this can be kind of fluid in terms of how FDA engages with the sponsor, depending on the drug or the therapeutic area that's being examined. If FDA thinks that there's enough to go ahead with a new drug application, then the sponsor then files it. And then within 60 days, FDA is required to make a decision regarding filing the drug for review. So starting the review process for that new drug application. And then subsequently, FDA, under a traditional approval, within 10 months period of time, has to make an approval decision. And along the way, they actually work with the sponsor around what the drug label will actually include and what information will be provided for healthcare professionals in prescribing this drug, and then also doing facility inspections to actually make sure that good manufacturing practices regarding the drug are being employed in producing the drug. Then finally, FDA then will approve the drug and send what they call a response letter to the sponsor, outlining kind of specific indications for approval. And then more importantly, and more so now, also if there are any requirements or commitments they want regarding post-approval studies. And this is what we call phase 4 studies that oftentimes looks at safety, but increasingly so, especially with the expedited review pathways, also looks at efficacy of various products that go through this pathway as well. And with post-marketing requirements or PMRs, these are required studies that sponsors have to do within a period of time, but there's also post-marketing commitments, which are more voluntary and requests from the FDA that they might ask from the sponsor. Next slide. So I just wanted to point out here, one of the other kind of issues that has come up, especially with the user fee reauthorizations, besides like how FDA approves these drugs, is how FDA is actually funded. And increasingly so, what we've seen since user fees actually came into being is that FDA is more and more reliant on these user fees, which are submitted by industry sponsors along with their applications to actually fund FDA's regulatory review activities. The balance actually has recently shifted, particularly for prescription drugs, in that FDA actually more relies, the majority of its budget actually comes from user fees from prescription drugs, specifically for regulation of that space, compared to what's actually being congressionally appropriated. And because these funds are coming from industry sponsors and negotiated with industry sponsors in terms of how they're being used, a lot of questions have been raised in terms of whether or not the independence of FDA as a regulator is being maintained, given that there is a pretty extensive negotiation period between industry that's providing these user fees that FDA relies on and the agency itself, and making these commitments to industry in terms of using these fees. So I just wanted to put that out there, and hoping that during our discussion we can talk about this a little bit more. And then the next slide. The last point I just want to kind of take away with is, I mentioned that there's kind of been a shift towards looking at phase 4 studies or these post-approval studies, especially when we think about expedited review pathways that will be discussed next. And this is some of our work from our group at EL Crit in looking at trends over time in terms of FDA's use of expedited review pathways, but also the standards for regulatory approval. What we're seeing now is that the rigor for a lot of these studies has decreased over time. Oftentimes it's just a single trial that's supporting approval, smaller patient populations, trials that are conducted more quickly, and oftentimes using proxy measures, or what we call surrogate endpoints, instead of clinical endpoints to actually justify our approval. And I'll say, just from a physician perspective, this increases a lot of uncertainty at the time of approval for an FDA approved treatment of whether or not it's actually clinically effective for my patients. And so this is kind of I think a lot of the discussion that's happening now with the FDA. How do we rebalance this shift in scales from kind of clinical certainty, making sure that the mandate of the FDA of ensuring safety and efficacy of products ahead of approval is also being balanced with timely access, and at the same time providing assurances both for patients but also clinicians and also payers in terms of the safety and efficacy of the drugs that come to market, and whether or not FDA has the authority to actually ensure that continued monitoring even after approval if drugs are being approved much more and more quickly. So I just wanted to kind of leave folks with those thoughts before we talk about expedited review pathways with our next speaker. And we can go to the next slide. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Reshma, for setting this up. So we are going to change gears now and look at expedited pathways. And Kelly George is going to give us a lot more detail about how that differs from the pathways that Reshma has just described for us.
Thanks, Marta. Next slide. Next slide. Perfect. So for this session, we are going to zoom in and we're going to focus on those expedited designations and pathways, as well as consider a little bit of what does it mean to balance competition and innovation. As you can see here, FDA Oversight is in the light blue. It starts all the way at the beginning of clinical development, as Dr. Ramachandran was telling us, all the way through lifecycle management of a product, including post-market studies, label extension, new indications, new route administration. So FDA is looking at these products the entire time from when they start manufacturing and they start developing the product all the way through once it's on the market. This is a good number of products, so it's over 20,000 products in the prescription drug product market. That's not even considering over-the-counter or other types of products they're looking at. Is over 13,000 facilities. They're keeping an eye on how the inspections are going, ensuring the products themselves are manufactured with high quality. And then for each product that comes through development, typical application is about 100,000 pages. So this is just a tremendous amount of work on FDA's shoulders that they're trying to keep on top of. And the question is, how do they take all of that work and really focus their resources on the most important decisions? Next slide. This is by no means a new question, right? FDA has been considering how do they speed the development and market access for high-value product for many years. First question is how you define a high-value product. And the second question is, what does it mean to prioritize workflow and agency energy? And what does it mean to support a product that's going to have a high value for patients? And how do you create efficiencies in that process? Now, of course, there had been a system back in the 70s, 80s. They had a system of therapeutic potential rating. This is a very generic, not too transparent approach. They had an ABC rating. Really simple, that products with an A rating got the most attention, products with a C rating got the least attention. But as more and more products came under their oversight, as Dr. Ramachandran mentioned, in '62 is when FDA was also charged with ensuring products on the market were effective. More and more products were taking longer and longer to get to the market. So there are a lot of conversations of how do we create a system that works both for industry and for patients and for the agency. And then we had the AIDS epidemic, which even pushed everything to the forefront and pushed that conversation even further forward. Congress took on this term drug lag, the time it takes for a product to be developed, applications submitted to FDA, and then FDA after you review them was just getting far too long, right? And so we see those UFAs, the user fee amendments, being implemented right after the AIDS epidemic in 1992. And you'll see each of these expedited programs in increments of 5, because that's the opportunity for industry and FDA and Congress to really say, what is the most efficient way to do what we're doing? And you'll see over the last 30 years, we've created new programs to address new needs as the pipeline has evolved. Next slide. So narrowing in on the 4 most commonly used programs: accelerated approval, priority review, fast track, and breakthrough. First thing I'll point out here is that each of these programs, they function and they provide support at different points in development. So we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then FDA review. You'll see accelerated approval in light blue is really supporting products later in development. It is an approval pathway. So Dr. Ramachandran talked about the type of evidence needed for the standard traditional pathway to getting a product to market. Accelerated approval is a separate set of evidence. Instead of substantial evidence, it's likely to benefit evidence. And so it allows for different type of product to enter the market and different type of product to address a separate type of disease. After the AIDS epidemic, that was really forefront in everyone's conversation. How do you get those types of products to patients? In green, you'll see the priority review. That's another expedited designation. That is just addressing how long FDA has to review a product. So when the UFAs came in, Congress gave FDA deadlines. Previous to that, FDA looked at applications and could really take as long as they want to come up with their assessment. UFAs really created a deadline as to how long FDA could look at an application. And the priority review was an opportunity to shorten that. If you had a product that was fully developed and was extremely promising, FDA could really focus their attention. Instead of taking 10 months to review, they just take 6 months. Up next, we have fast track and big breakthrough. You'll see they're both in navy because these are programs that allow for additional agency engagement, right? So more conversations with FDA, more data being gone back and forth, more ability to really chat with FDA and say, this is our plan, these are the challenges we have, what do you guys think? And have those conversations earlier on so that the development programs are headed in the right track all the way through, and they don't necessarily go off the track or do something they assume is gonna go in the right direction, but FDA isn't on board, right? So that way they can really stay in alignment with FDA. Next slide. So thinking more about the criteria, right? So how do each of these programs identify which products and which quote-unquote high-value products are appropriate for each of these? So accelerated approval, that is focused on the types of diseases that have long-term endpoints. So AIDS is a perfect example, but also cancer. When you're thinking about clinical trials for cancer, if you had to wait for every clinical trial to determine overall survival, those would be very long clinical trials. In the meantime, you have patients that are unable to get access to that drug. So accelerated approval is a process through which companies can measure shorter endpoints to ensure when they're likely to create benefit, patients can have access to that without having to wait years and years and years for overall survival or another long-term endpoint to finally pull data on. Priority review, now that is looking at data that's developed later in development that shows that it's a significant improvement in either safety or efficacy. And then fast track, in 1997, 5 years after the other two came on board, there was realization that there's also a need for additional attention earlier in development. So fast track is simply if you have a product that is life-saving and there are patients in need that currently don't have a treatment available. Fast track is an option for those types of products. So patients don't have a current option. Whereas breakthrough 5 years later is substantial improvement over available therapy. So that's a type of disease where there is a product on the market, but the product in development that would get breakthrough is even better than the product that is already on the market. Next slide. So transitioning here from prioritizing FDA's energy on high-value products to how do we ensure these high-value products are continually developed and incentivized, right? What kind of programs do we have put in place that balances competition and innovation? And there's several different organizations, agencies that come into this space. We have FTC, the Fair Trade Commission, is really focused on unfair trade. They're focused on anti-competitive behavior. Oftentimes this is a promotional approach or different contracts that companies are working together on that create monopoly markets or just unfair practices. We also have the US Patent and Trade Office. So their entire goal is to give out patents for intellectual property. These patents do expire after 20 years after the patent is received. And then you have market exclusivity. Oftentimes market exclusivity and patent exclusivity can be confused. So specifying that patent exclusivity is US Patent and Trade Office, whereas market exclusivity is from the FDA and begins at time of approval. And will vary in duration depending on what type of exclusivity FDA is granting that product. Next slide. Diving in deeper to these FDA exclusivities, this specific time each of them are able to have exclusivity on that product. And what that means, it can either mean that it's exclusivity for a product to not have a competitor follow-on product approved, or that a follow-on product can't submit a file. So if you take new biologic entity as an example, the first 5 years of a new biologic entity that gets approval, those 5 years, a biosimilar sponsor isn't able to submit a file to FDA. And then for 12 years, no biosimilar will be approved, right? And you can see that all the way through. And then there's exclusivity such as pediatric studies, which is 6 months, and it'll be added on to other type of exclusivities. These are really an incentive to create this temporary protection from competition to ensure companies that have an innovative product are able to recoup their losses in developing that product and have an incentive to continue innovating. Next slide. So where are we now? If you think about the expedited programs, we have 74% of novel products being approved from CDER in 2021 that received an expedited designation or pathway. 68% of them had priority review and about a third had fast track, accelerated approval, and breakthrough. I put this up there to really think through what does it mean to have an expedited program. I might add that if 74% of products are expedited and pushed to the front of the line, are they really at the front of the line, right? A lot of things are changing, and I'm wondering to what extent how we want to continue to reform these programs going forward to make sure we're focusing on those products that truly bring high therapeutic value to patients. And then thinking about competition and innovation, here's a chart looking at generic entry timing. So we have 55% of small molecules that have generic competition that is enters the market at the time you would expect it, and then 29% that's delayed. On average, you have 12.5 years that small molecule drugs on the market before competition, whereas they only got 5 years of exclusivity. So I leave it up to you guys to think through what is the appropriate time for innovative product to have exclusive access to the market. But simply put, that it's certainly something that needs to be continually addressed to identify how do you balance that competition versus innovation. Next slide. So thinking going forward as we mull over, are these the correct expedited programs to have in existence? Do these protocols work well? And does this innovation and balance function the way we want it to function? I'd say going forward, we are having a changing environment. There are a number of trends that are going to require more and more efficiency in how FDA and how industry functions to bring products to the market. One is simply that we are having far more products that are targeted on very small populations, orphan products. We have far more products coming through clinical trials and being run, more data is being collected. And the products that are being run in clinical trials and coming through the pipeline are just far more complex. The tiny little dot there you have, it's a small molecule. And then the larger one, that's a biologic. You can see the difference in complexity between those two compounds. And then I'd add, if you think about the size of a cell therapy, that's probably the size of the room you're sitting in, right? So the idea of bringing these more complex products to the market and helping them treat patients' needs, it's really a different paradigm. Next. Thank you, guys. I do want to show you the appendix that I put together. Next. Next. If you guys are interested in knowing the details of these expedited programs, you're able to download these slides. Next. And this slide as well for the details of FDA market exclusivities.
Thank you so much, Kelly. This is actually a very nice table that I recommend people download. So with that, I would like to turn the floor to Amit, who will talk some actually about a lot of the work that Portal has done to identify some of the trends that both Reshma and Kelly spoke to, and then also talk about what these trends mean for payers. Amit?
Sounds great. Can you guys hear me okay? Wonderful.
Yes, Amit, we can hear you.
Terrific. Okay, just wanted to make sure. So pleasure to be here. And next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit going off of Dr. Ramachandran and Dr. George's comments. What happens once a drug is FDA approved? Now, that comes with certain commitments. And unlike other countries, we don't have a national health technology assessment body. There are other countries like Germany that will take a look at the comparative effectiveness of a new drug, or countries like England that will take a look at the comparative cost effectiveness of a new drug. But we don't do that. And so there are various groups that might try to determine what the value of a new drug is, but there's no national scheme for that. And that presents an interesting question when we talk about what is happening as FDA puts more oversight in the post-approval space rather than the pre-approval space. And in terms of what we see with payers, it's important to recognize that once a drug is FDA approved, Medicaid must generally cover all FDA approved drugs. There have been some states that have attempted to request waivers to institute closed formularies for Medicaid, but those have not come to pass thus far. So really, whether it is a transformative drug or a clinically marginal drug, Medicaid is obligated to cover it. Now, it can impose certain procedural hurdles to getting the drug, but in general, it's going to have to pay for it. Medicare must cover all drugs in 6 classes, and those include anticonvulsants, antidepressants, antineoplastics, cancer drugs, antipsychotics, antiretrovirals, and immunosuppressants. Now, it's standard for whether or not it needs to cover the drug. Otherwise, that don't fall into those classes is that those drugs must be reasonable and necessary. Those closely aligns with FDA's approval standards, but they aren't one and the same. And so importantly, also, when we got to Part D for outpatient patient-administered drugs, the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003 prohibited CMS from negotiating on behalf of Part D plans. So in a sense, it's important to recognize that we have an environment in which we've sort of tied some major payers' hands in important ways in determining whether or not to cover certain products. That should be coupled with the fact that there is very aggressive marketing of pharmaceuticals, and much of that money isn't spent on the most transformative drugs. Those drugs don't really need an excessive amount of marketing. There have been $30 billion just in 2016 spent on marketing of drugs, disease awareness, lab tests, and health services. And a paradigm that the Federal Trade Commission noted a while back in the 70s is important. There's an interesting dynamic that this market doesn't function like other markets because the payer who pays doesn't choose, and that results in perhaps some inappropriate prescribing. And it's important that we have mechanisms that can address that. What we've seen right now is we have soaring net, and what I mean by net is after rebates and other concessions are taken into account, soaring net launch prices and price increases. Next slide. So Dr. Ramachandran talked about this a little bit, this shift from pre to post-market assessment. So it's important to recognize that FDA is fast. The overall median time to total approval in 2019 was about 9 months for a new drug. In 2020, Dr. George updated some even newer statistics, but 68% of new drugs qualified for an expedited development or review pathway. Again, going back to some evidence that Dr. Ramachandran cited, it's important to recognize that in terms of the evidence that is being used to support new drug approvals, there is less evidence and less rigorous evidence. Now, that is really a political choice, but it's important to see the facts here. So when considering the aggregate pivotal trials supporting each indication approval, the proportion of indications supported by at least 2 pivotal trials decreased from 80% to 60% to 52%. The proportion of indications supported by only single group pivotal trials increased from 4% to 12% to 17% over the span of 2 periods, over 3 periods over between decades. And so what is the implication of this? From a political standpoint, it may result in earlier access to some safe and effective therapies, and that's an important choice. It's a policy decision, but it can also result in more drugs entering the market that are later found to be unsafe or ineffective. Next slide. So what are we seeing now? Well, we're seeing more drugs, but how good are they and for what conditions? So there have been an increasing number of drug approvals over time. If you take a look at the mean annual number of drug approvals from 1990 to 1999, you had 25. If you took a look at 2010 to 2019, you had 40. And here's where I'd stop and just say that when we talk about innovation, I think it's important that innovation doesn't just mean new drugs, it means the quality of those drugs. And so particularly when we're talking about incentives for innovation, sometimes there are incentives that will yield more drugs, but not necessarily new drugs that are clinically transformative. And that's an important distinction when we talk about what might be helpful in terms of producing a more vibrant pharmaceutical market. So some new drugs that have come to market, there is no doubt, have been clinically transformational. Sofosbuvir, cure for hepatitis C, Kymriah, gene therapies coming to market. But of all new drugs approved by FDA in 2017, about 2/3 were rated by expert organizations in Germany, France, and Canada to offer no or minor additional benefits over existing treatments. So this goes back to the lack of a sort of health technology assessment body in the US to sort of say, well, how do these drugs compare to what's already on the market? Pharmaceutical companies act rationally. And they will act to maximize profits. And that is normal and that's to be expected. But because of that, and because of the way that FDA has interpreted its standards for drug approval, it is easier for companies to get oncology and orphan products to market. There is thus a disproportionate focus on drug companies in getting these products to market and away from risky and non-profitable markets like central nervous system drugs and tropical diseases. So you can just see this, 2 headlines here, one statistic, one headline, Amgen exits neuroscience. So you have companies exiting the neuroscience space because it is very difficult, very risky. And then you see here in terms of neglected tropical diseases, how much do they constitute compared to the overall number of new products that are entering the market. Next slide. So specifically, when we focus on accelerated approval, as of May 2022, there have been 278 drugs that have been approved under the accelerated approval pathway. The most common indications are oncology and rare diseases. Now, this is a very important pathway. As Dr. George said, it presents the opportunity to get promising new drugs to market. Now, I'm going to just highlight some of the challenges of the pathway. At the time of approval, these drugs have more uncertain benefits than do drugs that go through the normal approval pathway. And that's intentional, and that's the way the pathway is intended to set up. But there's no checks on the price of those drugs. And so if you took a look at just Medicaid spent 9.1% of its spending on accelerated approval drugs, which constituted only 0.4% of prescription use. So it is important to get post-market evidence of the effectiveness of these drugs and their safety. And one example that we can talk about more in Q&A that I'm sure everyone on the call has heard about is aducanumab, otherwise known as Aduhelm. And so the list price of this drug that was approved under an accelerated approval pathway is $56,000. ICER, a private company that will take a look, nonprofit that will take a look at the comparative cost effectiveness of drugs, estimated that for a cost effective price would be $3,000 to $8,000 per year. Of this drug, because of the coverage of this drug before CMS later made a coverage with evidence determination, CMS announced the largest increase in premiums in 15 years because of how many people they thought might be getting this drug. Now, the evidence in support of this drug was very, very minimal, and we can talk about that also in Q&A. So the problem is there are minimal incentives to complete required post-approval trials, and there's limited enforcement. So if you take a look at just a period from 1992 to 2016, 13% of accelerated approvals, of which 13% were on the market, a median of 9.5 years without confirmatory evidence. That is an incredibly long time. If you take the aducanumab example, FDA gives Biogen up to 9 years to complete this phase 4 study. So we're really operating in a period where you take a look at what Dr. Ramachandran was saying from the clinical standpoint, we're not getting that evidence in quick enough time. There's also a lengthy process for withdrawing an indication. The drug Makena is a classic example. And the result is that there is a greater gatekeeping role that is needing to be played by payers. And here you have Medicare basically saying that we don't think the evidence for a drug like aducanumab is that great, and we're going to insist on certain conditions if we're going to cover it. And I think that's a way of the future that you're increasingly going to see. Next slide. Yep, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amit. And so with that setup, I wanted to pass it on to Clay, who can talk about the political environment within which some of these reforms are being discussed right now.
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity. Great to be on the panel. And as Marta indicated, I'm going to kind of walk through the current political environment on the next slide, just a little bit of an outline of what you can expect. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk that long as much as I have that many sections. But what we'll do is just go through the overall political environment, that kind of what we're under as we look at the approval pathway, and then go into a deep dive on the FDA user fees and the reauthorization effort. The reason for that is the timeliness. I think we all know that Congress is hopefully on the verge of enacting legislation to reauthorize the user fees, and so it is the focus right now. We'll go through examples of past congressional efforts just to show where these past reauthorizations have fit, especially in the expedited programs that were talked about earlier, and then talk about the current congressional effort. And I think go over a real high level overview of that, and knowing that in the discussion section, we'll talk a little more. So with that, we can go to the next slide and the next slide after that. So basically, the current political environment is made up of not just what FDA does. Obviously, it's also made up of other factors as well. Really, those factors are the three branches of the federal government, as well as current events. From the FDA standpoint, what feeds into this political environment could be formal rulemaking. Example is the Accelerated Approval Pathway that came forward that was discussed earlier. Guidance documents, just recently on Friday, there was a breakthrough therapy designation guidance document that came forward. Those play a really large role, especially at FDA, just given the significance of guidance and those guidance documents that are put forward. The oversight activity of FDA is a very important element as well. That will go a long way toward feeding into what Congress may do, as well as the regulated industry as to how they'll react. And then finally, individual reviews. Those play a really large role in looking at it. As we talk about AgiHelm, obviously that was just one aspect of the utilization accelerated approval pathway, and here we are. We'll talk about that as where it fits as part of this current reauthorization effort. On the congressional side, we see oversight. We also see legislation. So while the legislation will be the focus today of what I discussed, the oversight really is significant and needs to be a big piece of this as part of the discussion. Where Congress spends its time and how it does it, and whether it does it, I would argue, in a productive way or unproductive way, play a really large role in how, and including as how the approval process looks. Unfortunately, we've seen examples of Congress, how that can be non-productive, especially just given the what FDA does and their important role in this whole effort. Finally, current events, that is another really big piece as we look at these. As we look at this approval pathway, we have also have the emergency use authorization that we've heard and learned so much more about because of COVID-19. That is really, as we look at how drugs get to market, that's an important factor, as well as something, I guess, news and activity around outside of just drugs. So other medical products that are regulated by FDA really play a really large role, and really on how FDA is viewed, especially by Congress and stakeholders. The infant formula shortage is a really big example right now. It's playing a really large role, as much as it's not, there's not a user fee there. It's playing a large role as part of the user fee effort. And then finally, the courts. I think the courts, you'll see different cases that come forward, which opine on FDA authority in different areas. We'll likely see a significant role of the courts around after the decision on Friday related to Dobbs. The FDA and its role and its authority vis-a-vis the states is going to be something that will be litigated likely, and so the courts loom large in this as well. But as I mentioned before, given the timeliness, we're going to spend our time on the FDA user fee reauthorization process, and so we can kick forward to that slide, please. So it'll be the next one. So what are these user fees? I've used the term a bunch of times already, and so I'll kind of do an overview as to what they actually are. So these are user fees. These user fees have come forward. They were started in 1992 as part of PDUFA, Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and they were done to provide additional resources for FDA to help basically review applications and around the review process. This has since proliferated, where since 1992, we've had other user fees that have come forward that are part of this process. One is the medical device user fee. There's also generic drug user fee and biosimilar user fee. Those two came in FDAsia in 2012. These are very important because, as others have mentioned, they form a significant amount and part of the budget for FDA. I think FDA needs more resources, and appropriators are going through that process now to try to provide that. But these user fees provide a significant amount and are really necessary to ensure that there is timely review of these products. We saw before 1992 of the acute nature and what that did to patients and the wait times that were there, how it had a negative impact on innovation. And since 1992, this PDUFA and these other user fees have added significantly to ensure that patients have timely access. Now, one thing to note is that these do expire. So whereas if you look at the federal government, you look at agencies, others, there are a number of authorizations that have expired that Congress has no intention and has not looked at. These user fees are different in that they do expire at the end of September. What that means is if Congress does not act, that basically those funds are no longer available. And FDA employees that have been on the front lines of helping, whether on the vaccine side, to therapeutics, to diagnostics across the board, to providing what is necessary for our world to deal with COVID, they could lose their jobs. And so that is something nobody wants. And the hope is that Congress could step forward and get this done as soon as possible, get this law enacted as soon as possible. I think the hope would be at the end of July, because there's this pink slip issue where under federal law, there's 60 days is required notice for federal government employees if there's an expectation they could lose their jobs. But so that's called like a pink slip issue. Unfortunately, kind of where we are, we're not sure that deadline will be met by Congress, but it is important that hopefully they get done as expeditiously as possible, definitely by the end of September. So with that, on the next slide, these user fee programs, after a negotiation with industry, on the next slide, if you can go to the next slide, these user fees provide a significant amount of reform in and of themselves. The commitment letters, if you review them, you'll see a significant amount of basically policy that comes forward, whether it's additional money for, in the PDUFA context, for cell and gene therapy, for CBER, to provide those resources necessary so that they have the scientific, the scientists necessary to look at this very challenging issue, to more patient engagement, something that's been a huge part of priority for Congress, stakeholders, and FDA for a number of years, definitely since 2012. So those just in and of themselves, they provide a significant amount and important policy change and resources that are necessary to do that. But they also, what they do is they provide a vehicle for Congress to conduct additional oversight of FDA. So you'll see in the hearings as part of the process, Congress will be asking questions on, are we reaching the right balance on promoting innovation, to providing safety, to ensuring access, big questions, to specific questions on just very topics that some may consider minor, but are really important for Congress to make sure that, to work to FDA, work with stakeholders to ensure that the policy, the law there is as up to date as possible. Some of those policies that come forward are those policy reform, those riders, those add-ons, there's different words for them, but that gets added on to the legislative vehicle because this is a must pass. I mentioned that these user fees do expire, and so it is a must pass. It's a vehicle for change, for reform. And so you'll see Congress, stakeholders, even FDA will ask for additional authority so that they can update the statute and update their ability to address just the public health concerns or challenges or that are out there. On the next slide, we can go through just how they've done that in the past. Next slide, please. And then next slide. So here are just some examples of what we've seen in the past. FDAMA, the Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act of '97, that was the basically where PDUFA originally got reauthorized. You'll see as part of that legislation, that's where fast track came to be. So Congress moving and looking at the approval pathway and working with FDA to provide that necessary legislative change. On the next slide, I've talked a lot about innovation, but safety obviously is a really important factor as well for FDA. And in 2007, there were concerns related to the authority of FDA due to some challenges, some issues that had arisen in the pharmaceutical market. So with that came REMS, the risk evaluation mitigation strategies, the REMS that are attached to individual drugs as they get approved, so that as FDA weighs that benefit risk, they have that ability to add these REMS to ensure that that balance is reached and they believe it's safe and effective, it can reach the market. So that's just an example of where those authorities have not only been on innovation, but also on safety as well. In FDASIA on the next slide, that was 2012, where you saw the introduction of the breakthrough therapy designation. that we've heard about during this webinar as well. I'm sure we'll have additional discussion on too. And then there are also some changes that were made related to the accelerated approval pathway and others as well. So that was happened in 2012. And then finally in 2017, as part of the reauthorization, the FDARA is as it's known on the next slide. That is where patient engagement, I mentioned patient engagement has been a big priority issue for a number of different stakeholders, including FDA and Congress. There were additional policy that came forward around patient experience data. And I think we see that as part of this reauthorization, the continued building on that patient experience and trying to find ways to better incorporate it as part of the approval process. And I think we'll continue to see that in coming years as we better understand how to systematize that, and as different diseases and conditions and those living with those diseases and conditions can better get incorporated, want to get incorporated in that process. So on the next slide, I'll skip ahead 2 slides, we'll kind of talk about the current and where we are right now. So where we are right now is FDA transmitted the commitment letters that basically embody and have all the information on that agreement between industry as well as FDA on what the user fees and how those will be utilized in the next 5 years. Those came in January, and since that time, the legislative process has been underway at Energy and Commerce Committee and at Senate Health Committee related to that. So we've seen legislative hearings and we've seen different discussions on a number of topics. And now they've basically moved from discussion now to moving that bill through the legislative process. Right now, where they are is in the informal negotiations. This is not a formal conference, as you're seeing with USICA, which is a bill that's being considered right now. This is informal. So Health and Energy and Commerce Committee staff are working together to try to come forward with an agreement that would basically reauthorize these user fees, take additional riders as well, and get that to President Biden's desk as soon as possible. It's the expectation that they will try to do this as quickly as possible, but as we'll discuss further, these bills are heavy with additional policy, not just in drugs, in the drug world, but also dietary supplement, cosmetics. There's also a paradigm shift in diagnostics that's incorporated called VALID. And so with that, these negotiations are very substantive and could take a long time. And so I think as much as stakeholders and FDA and Congress want to get this done as soon as possible, there's a sense that it may take longer than expected to get that done. Now, let's go to the next slide. In the House bill, which has passed the House on a big bipartisan vote, which is very encouraging, it does include a number of key provisions, including on accelerated approval. So accelerated approval, because of AduHelm and other things, has been a really big focus for Congress. And so we're seeing elements in the House bill as well as the Senate bill on accelerated approval, as well as with real-world evidence that some want to further incorporate as part of that accelerated approval pathway as well. So we can circulate these slides later. These are just some of the provisions that are included as around accelerated approval. On the next slide is the Senate, what the Senate includes, and they've moved through the Health Committee. They have not gone to the floor. It also includes a number of pieces related to accelerated approval, basically according to the sponsors, to help make it clarify the accelerated approval authority, as well as to provide additional pieces where you can see here there's an interagency coordinating council to help FDA as it looks at it. I'll conclude now and just go to concluding thoughts where, skip a few slides, just next slide, please. What we see here is that the current political environment, and we're all living through this, it is incredibly fluid, right? I mean, every day, it's not just in healthcare, but there's a different event that happens, or unfortunately sometimes tragedies that come forward to make this political environment incredibly fluid, especially with FDA. And right now, the reason why we're spending time on this user fee reauthorization process is it will be the center focus on FDA issues the next few months. And issues could arise, but we'll see that this is going to be where hopefully the Senate, the House, President Biden can get an agreement and move it forward expeditiously. This drug approval process, though, as much as there will be changes, including possibly on accelerated approval as part of this, it's going to continue to evolve post this reauthorization process. So as much as we focused, and I focused on that today, please know that there will be, because of how important this is, it will continue to change. That's going to be because advances in science. I would argue that we've heard earlier about the lack of evidence or the lack of the clinical trials aren't robust. I would argue that maybe that's because the science has advanced so much, and we know so much more about those drugs and the underlying biology, such that those clinical trials, as much as they are an integral part, they don't have, the evidence is there to approve, such that we need to get that to patients in an expeditious way, as well as we don't need to subject patients to those clinical trials if we know it works. The focus on access is going to be a really big part of this, right? Not only we saw the right to try, we continue to see right to try. We saw that a lot during the Trump administration, whether pre-market or post-market. Post-market access is going to be really important here, that they can actually get to patients. And so I know that is going to be a really big discussion as we see these cell and gene therapies come forward, and we've been trying to better understand that. That is something that out of the FDA context, but trying to figure out like where value fits, where some of these these arrangements can be forward, these value-based arrangements can come forward to help in that regard. And then finally, onto demand for patient engagement, that's going to continue to be a very important part of this, and continuing to figure out, like, as much as we talk about FDA's role, the patient's role is even larger, right? Where they're the ones who are going to be taking these therapies, and their views on what matters has to be front and center. We've seen really great evolution and advancements in that. I think we'll continue to see that. And then finally, we'll close with the congressional side of this, where a lot of my time has been focused. It can be very productive and very helpful, but we also have to understand that it needs to be met with a very substantive and thorough and adult conversation. Because as much as everybody points fingers around an Aduhelm or others, Congress and stakeholders, I think, need to take and understand that FDA is under tremendous pressure as they look at these reviews, and we need to make sure that we're not just knee-jerk reaction, whether it's a change to the accelerated approval pathway or pointing blame at somebody, when it may be that the actual challenges that need to be addressed are, we need to better prepare them and help them as on these issues. For example, in the neuroscience space, providing the resources necessary for FDA so it has the latest science, and so that as these challenges look at these challenges, they can get to where cancer is, where oncology is, that they understand the mechanisms of action, they understand the underlying science that has made the ability to utilize accelerated approval that much more beneficial, because they know when a tumor shrinks, the drug is working and it should get to a patient. So with that, I'll close and turn it back to you, Marta. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Clay. So actually, if I could now invite all of the panelists to come on video. And also for those of you in the audience, I know some of you have been submitting questions. I invite you to submit your questions. I am not going to be able to get to all of them. We only have 15 minutes of discussion left, and so I wanted to encourage you to send in questions that directly relate to the issues of accelerated approval. I might not be able to get to some of the sort of other drug-related questions that are really important, but probably outside the scope of this presentation discussion. So let me actually just to take Congress aside for a moment. I wanted to ask about FDA's ability, willingness, and interest in addressing some of the issues that Amit raised in terms of evidence generation. I wanted to ask sort of your take on that. Do we need Congress to be involved in the solution or not. You know, one example that comes to mind is the breakthrough designation pathway. FDA just issued a guidance. So I wanted to ask your thoughts around FDA's role in being able to address this sort of balancing and potentially rebalancing of the, you know, creating a lot of access, but how do we generate the data? Reshma, maybe I'll start with you, and then let me know who else would like to jump in.
Yeah, sure. I can, definitely speak to this. I mean, there's a number of there's a wide authority, or pretty broad authority that FDA does have to actually carry out these actions. Even in terms of like accelerated approval, the way that current statute is actually written is that FDA actually has pretty broad authority to employ standards for oversight of accelerated approval drugs, but more importantly also withdrawal. And so there's kind of this little bit of a tension that occurs in terms of FDA wanting to exercise the authority or kind of receiving validation through a congressional vote, through a user fee rider that actually has accelerated approval reforms that comes into play as well. But one of the things that we had been like noting and looking at a number of the policies that FDA has expressed support of. So each year FDA actually submits a budget to Congress, and as a part of that, they actually include legislative reforms that they're supportive of. And those give a great story, and that actually tells you it's very telling to actually what FDA is willing to actually do in terms of reforms or policies that they are willing to move forward on. And in there, you'll see that they've actually highlighted a couple of things that are already in the user fee package, most notably the accelerated approval reforms that Congress is considering, and even going beyond what's actually in front of House and Senate actually currently. But these sorts of reforms are things that the agency could actually do outside of statute, through guidance, through regulatory policy, through rulemaking as well. There's some concern that Congress will codify and kind of tie FDA's hands. So let's say, for instance, Congress says there's specific stipulations around withdrawal of drugs, or even with breakthrough designation, for instance. That's the guidance that FDA came out with. Let's say Congress says, we're going to actually put specific rules about how FDA is going to withdraw these drugs, how FDA is going to withdraw breakthrough designation. That actually ties FDA's hands, regardless of administration, who comes in as FDA commissioner, who's in that seat as an appointee, in terms of what they are able to do. And so there's a little bit of a tension between that in terms of what Congress actually proposes and also what FDA is supportive of. But Congress does, obviously meet with FDA pretty routinely to actually get their insight in terms of what's capable and what's not. And the other part of this that comes into play is administrative burden. And that relates to also what sorts of resource capacity that they have. If user fees being negotiated with industry does not allow for those user fees to be used for FDA activities, then FDA is heavily reliant on Congress for appropriations. And in the medical device space, that's particularly important because we're seeing right now, even with MDUFA being discussed, things like post-market surveillance or post-approval studies are not really being a part of the MDUFA discussions. And whereas FDA needs resources and staffing to be able to actually do that. And that's where congressional appropriation comes into play. So even though they want to do these things and carry out these activities, they might not be able to do so just because of budget constraints and resource capacity as well.
Any
I
other?
can also chime in there. The other thing to think about here is the trends we're seeing in type 1 versus type 2 error, right? The concerns for FDA, if FDA were to approve a drug that shouldn't be approved versus FDA not approving a drug that should be approved, right? And I think AdvoHelm really leaned into this conversation as you have more folks having a conversation of what FDA is and is not approving and what the evidence looks like. It's going to shift FDA's approach to that type 1 versus type 2 error.
I'll jump in too, just to say, agree with the thought that there's a lot of authority for FDA under its 505 Food Drug Cosmetic Act. And I think looking at some of these activities as more of a validation exercise rather than an authority exercise. I mean, if you look at breakthrough designation from 2012, FDA could have done that without that statute, but that helped FDA leadership move that forward and bring that important authority and basically put Congress, showed the support of Congress, pat on the back to push to stress that at FDA. And so that as we look at that tension, it's really important in that FDA, who's implementing, FDA's implementing this, their implementation, a lot of times when I was on the Hill, we would talk to folks about some of the challenges that we were hearing about, and they said it's not a problem with the statute, it's on the implementation, and so we don't actually need you to do anything. It's just a matter of getting FDA's, just asking FDA to do that. So it's an important consideration as these statutes are moving forward, as to actually why, if they're necessary, and why they're necessary.
So a related question is around, going back to evidence generation, right? How do we solve the evidence generation problem? One of the approaches that has been proposed and discussed is what's called real world evidence. And it was, I think, mentioned very briefly in one of your presentations. Kelly, I was hoping you could maybe help define what that is and sort of where we stand on it currently, and then I'll open it up for discussion about, to what extent this helps move the needle in the right direction. So, Kelly.
Absolutely. So real world data, real world evidence, this is the type of data that's collected outside of traditional clinical, right? And this is by no means a new type of data set. Originally, it was defined in legislation. 21st Century Cures 2006 gave FDA the mandate to actually use real world evidence, not just for the safety studies as they had used in the past, but also for new indications and new products coming on the market. What we saw during the pandemic, however, was that real world evidence really gave, the agencies had more experience with real world evidence, and it hit so many headlines that it supercharged the attention of real world evidence. Right, you saw it all over the place, and I think both the agencies gaining experience and having to use real world evidence in real time to understand what's going on with COVID, as well as the attention it caught. All types of folks who in the past were not necessarily interested or part of the conversation of evidence generation were now coming and asking and saying, what is real world evidence? How can I leverage it, right? And how can you unite real world evidence with clinical trials to really show a value of a product and better understand how that product is working in patients? I think that's where we're headed with real world evidence, but I would caution that it's going to take time to get there, right? RCTs took so many years to mold into what we see today. Real world evidence is still on that same path. The train was heading in a direction, public health emergency really supercharged it, but there's a long ways to go until we can get it to mold into what we really need it to be.
Kelly, before I turn it over to other speakers, RCTs, can you please clarify what that means?
Sure, randomized controlled trials.
Sort of the bread and butter of how normally these kinds of trials.
Traditional controlled, clinical trials, the way we typically run clinical trials.
All right, Reshma, as a clinician, I wanted to ask you sort of your thoughts about real world evidence and how this fits in this picture.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about real world evidence, especially even within the user fee agreements, particularly around accelerated approval and to support regulatory decision making FDA. I mean, there's some promise for sure, especially in terms of identifying safety signals for novel drugs that we've seen. The FDA uses this extensively with the Sentinel initiative in particular. And the idea of being able to use electronic health record data, patient registries, kind of non-traditional data that's outside of the typical clinical trial space to be able to rapidly generate evidence around safety in particular has been very promising. On the efficacy side, it's been a mixed picture, to be honest. And there's some promise, but again, as Kelly mentioned, we're just not quite there yet. And so some of the caution that we have, especially around legislation codifying the use of real world evidence to support or even potentially replace clinical trial evidence, comes from some of the research that we've done that's shown that we have some limitations in terms of these sorts of data being able to do so. So particularly for accelerated approval, there's been proposals to use real world evidence to replace clinical trials for post-approval studies to actually confirm clinical benefit. And our research has shown in looking at the past decades approval of accelerated approval drugs, if we actually try to replicate those clinical trials using real world evidence, we're not actually able to do so. And in fact, for a majority of clinical trials for approved FDA treatments, we also find the same thing in our research as well. So there is definitely promise. Only this past year did FDA actually have a supplemental indication using real world evidence for Prograf, which is a drug used to treat for kidney transplant patients in particular. And they actually only found that real world evidence data could be used as a complement or a supplement to clinical trial data, not just by itself. So FDA is working very painstakingly. They put out like 4 or 5 guidances this past year alone around real world evidence to be able to get a better picture about how this could be shaped. But there's still some like kind of bread and butter like barriers, like the fact that electronic health records don't speak to each other across different health systems. Patients see providers in different places. And oftentimes, patient registries don't include a control arm to be able to assess whether or not a drug that's being looked at is being compared to a placebo or a comparator. And so I think there's certain limitations to this. And so our worry with some of the congressional proposals that the horse is out of the barn a little bit too fast, and that we need to have additional safeguards and studies that the FDA is already doing right now to be able to know for sure that real world evidence can be used effectively.
And Amit, I also know that this is a topic of great interest to you, so I wanted to know if you had any additional comments.
Sure. I think Dr. Ramachandran covered a lot of my thoughts, but I think it's important to know the ongoing efforts that FDA is taking. And so one I just want to highlight is one that involves my division is called Duplicate, and really trying to figure out where there is the capacity for real world evidence to fulfill some of the objectives we're seeing, what the challenges are that are remaining before moving too quickly on relying on, from a regulatory standpoint, on evidence that we still don't know some of the weaknesses of.
So let me take a question from the audience and add a little bit to it. The question is, at what point will personalized drug prescribing by NDA testing be incorporated in FDA interaction? Or sort of a broader question around, personalized medicine, medicine for one. How do you see, well, I guess one question is, when is this coming? And how does this fit in all of what we have discussed in terms of, again, creating access and also trying to generate evidence and for physicians and for payers? Who would like to try that on?
I'm happy to jump in. I think it's hard to say for sure when personalized medicine. No, I don't really have a crystal ball to actually, to know for certain when personalized medicine would, come into play. There's obviously a lot of ongoing efforts to actually make this happen, and even clinics being piloted around the country to actually look at, what we call personalized medicine, but also precision medicine as well. And some of this also relates to looking at, the fact that clinical trials oftentimes include specific subpopulations of patients. They oftentimes include like younger, healthier patients, usually tend to be more white patients, and the fact that we just need more representation in clinical trials. And so a reaction to that has also been personalized medicine, the idea that we're going to be able to, prescribe medicines to patients, but also having an understanding that the medicines actually work for the patients that they're indicated for. And so I think there's a little bit of a tension around that in terms of the investments in terms of personalized medicine, but also efforts to do more whole scale representation, diversity efforts in clinical trials. And that's some of the things that are being addressed in the user fee legislation. FDA has been trying to do this for a long time. A lot of encouragement of sponsors to actually increase representation in clinical trials in this space. But I think the big part that's missing in this is enforcement, and the lack of enforcement that's led to kind of continued issues around making sure that the drugs that are being approved and who they're indicated for actually reflect the clinical trial populations that they're being tested in. And there's oftentimes a disconnect. So, obviously that it kind of brings in the role of personalized medicine, but whether or not that's going to be operationalized and then thinking about reimbursement and how payers play in that role, that's going to be very, very interesting to see in years to come. And I'm sure some of our other folks on this panel might have some comments on that piece as well.
Well, I can just add there, this is an area that's prime for global harmonization, right? The way you develop a personalized medicine, it's challenging to manufacture, it's challenging to pull together with our current clinical trial system. But if we're looking at very specific subpopulations, then having globally harmonized regulations allow those products to actually be developed with the same expectations from the US to Canada to UK to Europe and then across the globe. And so I think we see a lot of regulators having those conversations and using this as the next step beyond COVID of how do these conversations happen? How do you harmonize the regulations for personalized medicine going forward?
I'm realizing, the time is basically up for us. We could have a discussion for probably yet another hour. There are a lot of questions that we didn't have a chance to get to. But what I wanted to do in the last couple of minutes is to ask each one of you to give us closing remarks. What are the things that, what are sort of the takeaways for the audience? What is it you want to leave them with? And really like in 15 seconds each. So maybe I will start let's go in the order in which we actually did the presentation. So Reshma.
Yeah, for sure. I think the main thing I want to just take away for the audience to take away is that there's a balance that needs to be struck here, right, between timely access, to potentially promising treatments. And this is something I face as a clinician every day in seeing patients in which sometimes there's limited access or limited access or no options at all in terms of not having like FDA approved therapies. And Alzheimer's disease is kind of a quintessential example of this, where I see a number of older adults, they have Alzheimer's disease, we don't have a cure in place. But the FDA, approved a drug that was, potentially promising, and I think a number of us were waiting with bated breath to see if this might be, something that we could use for our patients. And we were unfortunately like really disappointed that regulatory standards and approval standards were compromised, with aducanumab, with Aduhelm, ultimately in terms of compromising both patient safety but also efficacy as well. And I think the big thing I want to just make sure is that, with the user fee agreements, that's the tension that we're seeing here, the need for balancing timely access and not just speed, but also making sure that safety and efficacy are paramount. Again, quality of these products that are being approved by the FDA and ensuring that FDA's role as a regulator is being instated, and not necessarily catering to the industry sponsors that are providing the user fees in the first place.
Kelly.
So one of the things I'm thinking about as we consider reforms to FDA as a whole, to the expedited programs, as the UPA is coming up, keep in mind that many of the frameworks and systems we have in place were created in a world of small molecules. They're created in a world of much more localized production and distribution of products. We now have far more complex products, more specific subpopulation we're trying to target, trying to get more diversity in clinical trials. There's just a very different types of products that are coming through the market and different types of questions we're trying to answer. So I'd say now is a perfect time to consider reforms, but it's worth harnessing and understanding what is the fit for purpose, not just the fit for purpose that existed decades ago, but the fit for today's purpose, and how do we appropriately create that balance to incentivize the right products to come to market, but to have a sustainable marketplace going forward.
Amit?
Sure. I think I would just like to leave the audience with the notion that we are heading into an increasing situation in which there is going to be a little bit less stock placed in FDA approval and a little bit more of a gatekeeping role being played by payers. And I think this is going to come as a jolt to the system. I think a lot of people are not necessarily going to be happy about this, but we need to make sure that there are rules in place that ensure that we're not rationing on the basis of cost alone, that we are really having the ability to promote access to quality products, and that's going to take all stakeholders to come to the table.
And Clay?
First, thanks so much for the opportunity. This has been a great discussion, and to just say, just give a lot of credit for Alliance for Health Policy. These are discussions that need to be had. These, as we look at the approval process, it's got to evolve, right? We're going to have better science. We're going to have just different factors coming in, and so having these discussions around where it should go, especially agree with the panelists around cell and gene therapy. Some of these challenges are going to be even more acute, and so we just need to make sure that we are having these discussions so that access can be, we can make sure patients get access to these, because they are all of these expedited programs, they deal with serious and life-threatening diseases, and we need to make sure they can get access. So thanks for the opportunity. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you, Clay, and thanks to all of our great panelists for their insights on this important topic. This is all the time we have for today. For the audience, please take time to complete the brief evaluation survey that you will receive immediately after the broadcast ends. Please keep an eye on the Alliance website for details about future upcoming events. And a recording of this webinar and additional materials will be available on the Alliance website. This concludes today's webinar on FDA approval process. Andrea, Reshma, Kelly, Amit, and Clay, thank you so much for joining us today.